All right, everyone, here we are again. This time we're going to take a look at performance and the LC5 performance tab with regards to requesting a takeoff performance, landing performance. Your takeoff data, what you get there, we're going to go through all those fields and try to explain some of that to you in case you have questions. And then, of course, down at the bottom there where it says ACARS runway, that's our TLR data, which is our takeoff and landing report. And what you're going to use that for is if you had an engine failure and what your instructions would be for that sort of thing. On the right side, you've got the departure and arrival parameters, and those should sync up for the most part. Otherwise, you can enter those parameters to modify your takeoff and landing data. And we'll start here at the top left here, your takeoff data. You got your outside air temperature. Most of this should sync automatically. So 23 degrees centigrade outside air temperature. Winds today 189 at 9. QNH, our altimeter setting of 2988. What runway we're departing off of, runway 1 right, which we can input here. And if you look down at the bottom and scroll down, you can also see the data for the runway. In this case, you'd have 9,771 feet. Your planned maximum takeoff weight of 153.1. Just put the decimal in there yourself. That's how the real report is too. It doesn't have a decimal. What the EFP would be in that case, we'll come back to that. Stopping margin, so 1,710. Basically what that means is if we were to do an accelerate stop, so we start our takeoff roll, we get up to just prior to V1, have an engine failure, had to abort and stop on the runway. That's telling us that we would stop with 1,710 feet remaining of that 9,771 feet. Our ATOG, which is our available takeoff gross weight of 153,100 pounds. We talked about that in the dispatch release. Essentially what the ATOG is your aircraft's maximum available takeoff gross weight. And it's going to be limited by one of three things we talked about also in the dispatch release, either takeoff limited, landing limited, or en route limited. And for a better explanation of that, you can watch that video. Our takeoff weight, what our actual takeoff planned weight today is, 138,100 pounds. And then our maximum runway takeoff weight, think of that as what the runway that we're using, in this case, runway 1 right, and what our max takeoff weight to use that particular runway would be for today. Of course, our actual takeoff weight needs to be less than both our ATOG and the MRTW. The ATOG cannot be exceeded under any circumstances. The MRTW can be adjusted, but the only way you're really going to be able to do that or adjust that weight is to use a different runway, maybe a longer runway. A runway that's maybe turned more into the wind, or another scenario where maybe you take off at a different time of the day where it's a cooler temperature is going to increase that MRTW number. And then you're also going to have the limit code. In this case, we got a C, which is climb, limited by climb gradient requirements. There's a lot of different reasons or limits that you can get. Some of the ones that might be common that you might see, more likely going to be climb, which is a C, the F, or field, which would be limited by field length requirements. You might see that with a short runway. O, or obstacle, limited by obstacle clearance requirements. So if you had an O, you might see a low weight or a lower weight because maybe there's obstacles off the departure of the runway. And if you were to lose an engine at V1, you'd have to be at or below a specific weight to be able to have the climb performance to clear those obstacles. So this is going to do all that thinking and calculation for you. S for structural, limited by maximum structural weight of the aircraft. T, tires limited by tire speed limitations, and I think that is yet to be implemented, but they're working on that. Or V, VMCG, which is essentially your airspeed minimum control on the ground. And what that means is a certain speed at which the rudder becomes effective on the ground to maintain directional control. And of course, you have the tiller, which makes a huge difference in that. But yeah, you may or may not see the V or V for VMCG. The next line, selected temperature. So in this case, configuration, we've got a reduced climb thrust setting. We did not request max thrust. And so that output there, what we'll put in the FMC to get ourselves a reduced thrust takeoff would be 51 degrees centigrade. And so that's going to output a N1 takeoff power setting of 93.2. We'll come back to the all engines. John, you can help me explain that one. Flaps, this is going to be 5 in this case. I believe we're running an 800 here. You can get a flaps 1 takeoff in the 800, although it's very, rare. I don't think you're ever going to see it. Essentially what we got is for 800 of the max 8, flaps 1 takeoffs have the least tail clearance. And so really what it is it's a provision for tail strike protection on takeoff. I'll read this statement here to you two here. It's takeoff flaps. PWB selects based on several variables, including the appropriate flap setting. If a reduced thrust takeoff is possible, PWB will select the flap setting that yields the greatest amount of thrust reduction. So you're going to see the greatest amount of thrust reduction in your N1s. If max power takeoff is required or requested through PWB, PWB selects the flap setting or provides the highest maximum runway takeoff weight. So there's other reasons that you would ask for or get max power takeoff. One of which would be if you selected wind shear, you'd always get a max takeoff power setting. It says, note, flap 1 will only be used if necessary for maximum weight capability. I don't think you're going to see it often.
And that's on the 800.
On the 800.
Yeah.
Yep, you'll get
the max, I believe the max too. Yeah.
And the max 8, A firm. The 700, you'll get flaps 1 all the time. Often, in fact. Here we got V speeds of 136, 138, 142 at the trim setting of 5.6 and a min cleanup altitude of 3,200 feet. Most of the time your min cleanup altitude is going to be 1,000 feet above airport elevation. And this is actually an example for Vegas. And this is actually going to be a 1,019 feet AGL. So that brings it up from, I think, 20, whatever it is, up to 3,200 feet. And then the EFP, or your engine failure procedure, it says special. Oftentimes you'll see just a DT and a space, it'll say H, and that's going to be the heading that you're going to fly in case you had an engine failure. If it says DT with an H, it's just going to be runway heading, you'll see. It might say LTH or RTH, that'll be left turn or right turn at the min cleanup altitude for the engine failure procedure. These down here, if it says special, you're going to have to look down here. It's going to say non-standard engine out, all engine minimum cleanup 3,200 feet, and it's got a special. So in the case of that, let's jump forward 2 pictures here. This is an example of Vegas. Departing runways 1 left or 1 right at Vegas. Complex special EFP, runway 1 left, 1 right. Doing the Gidget Knights, Razzler, or Rat Pack departure. RNF departure off 1 left, 1 right. And it says here, min cleanup altitude, engine out 3,200 feet or all engine 3,200 feet, regardless whether it's you have an engine failure or not. Regardless, it's all engine is also 3,200 feet. Where you start that, you pitch the nose over. It's the set speed, flaps 1, climb thrust, or whatever the call out might be. Before you accelerate and start to clean up, bring the flaps up. So if you did a flaps 5 takeoff, it'd be set speed flaps 1, climb thrust. You'd start that, initiate that at 3,200 feet MSL. And so this EFP, this is a special, complex special, and it says engine failure at V1 to before KIBAD, so KIBAD being out here. What are you going to do? You're going to climb via the SID, min cleanup altitude 3,200 feet, and you're going to hold at KIBAD. So this is essentially if you had an engine failure. You're going to climb out here to KIBAD, you're going to enter the hold, at or above minimum published altitude for intended route, request radar vectors, or resume own navigation. Decision point 1, if you had an engine failure at or after KIBAD, you could just continue on the SID. That one's pretty simple and self-explanatory. I do have one more here that I want to show you because there is a technique that we can use. This is one here for midway off of runway 4 right. And it's also labeled as a simple special. Everything else at midway is simply runway heading. This one here, what you want to do is at 3.8 DME off IMDW, which is the localizer for runway 4 right. At DME of 3.8 IMDW, 1,100 feet MSL if IMDW is out of service. So you just essentially climb to 1,100 feet, then turn right. But with the DME operating at DME of 3.8, you're going to turn right to heading 090. Min cleanup altitude is 1620. At midway, that happens to be exactly 1,000 feet. But the reason I like this one or wanted to point this out is anytime you have one of these where it says add a DME, what you can do is you can go into your fix page on the FMC. What you could do is you could put IMDW in the fix page, and then in that first line you can do a slash 3.8, and that'll draw a circle around that fix. So it'll draw a circle around IMDW right here. It'll draw a 3.8 mile circle. And so all you got to do is just fly that heading until you hit the edge of that circle, and then turn right heading to 090. So you can use the fixed page. That can be a good reminder. Something you can do. Back to this. So we've got this page here. Let's go to the next one. John, do you have anything you want to add on any of that?
I would just mention that wind is always going to be a magnetic, and PWB, well, obviously PWB takes this into consideration, but L5, we've added this into L5 where it'll actually take the airport's published magnetic variation into account as well. So that is the most accurate wind right there that you're getting from PWB. And you're going to want to put that in your takeoff ref page 2. You want to put that wind in, and by doing so, your N1 should match up pretty close to what your L5 PWB N1 of 93.2 in this case. It should be about zero point 0.1 or so difference, if that. So it should be pretty close, but you got to put that wind in for sure, exactly how that wind says right there, in order to get that. Let me see if there's anything else. I would just mention with the runways, anything that has a slash for takeoff for those runways, that's an intersection departure. So if you look
Down
at
here.
the ACARS runway list right there, runway 1 left at Bravo, that is an intersection departure, runway 1 left at intersection taxiway Bravo. Just so you guys are aware of that. The other thing too, stopping margin, something else to take into consideration. I don't know if L5, if we've implemented this just yet. We're going to work on getting this added. But if you have a stopping margin of less than 1,500 feet remaining, and it does not give you max thrust numbers, you need a force max thrust because that's the Southwest policy of if PWB will force max thrust takeoff if there's less than 1,500 feet remaining. And we'll get that added to LUVCARS 5 if we haven't already. We'll have to take a look at the back end and verify Ryan got that done. Other than that, I really can't think of anything else. Just remember, guys, it's a lot of people think in the sim world that flaps 5 is the only flap setting used in 737. That's the farthest thing from the truth. Anything from flaps 1, 5, 10, 15, or 25, they all can be used. John Wayne, there's special conditions for John Wayne. If you look at on our SharePoint website, you could see our station information page for Southwest Virtual Airlines. You could see the information for John Wayne departure specifically. The 700 is only certified out of John Wayne for flaps 5 and flaps 10 takeoffs, or the max thrust takeoffs, off runway 20 right. And for the max and the 800, it's flaps 15 out of John Wayne, max thrust takeoff off runway 20 right. It always is a max thrust takeoff off runway 20 right, and you got to follow that close-in noise abatement procedure. Other than that, I really can't think of anything else. Just make sure you guys are setting that trim setting, very important. Don't set the trim setting on the takeoff ref page 2. That's only for max thrust takeoff. That will, the only time that will be accurate is if you're doing a max thrust takeoff. If you're doing a reduced thrust takeoff, you got to use the trim setting from PWB and LUVCARS 5, right there, that 5.6, very important. And then the min clip altitude, just make sure you guys are aware of this. So the min's barrow that you set your minimums for approach altitude, you're going to do the same thing for your min cleanup. So min cleanup, you're going to set 3,200 in this case. You're going to get that green bar on your PFD on the altitude tape. You're going to get that to get all the way up to 3,200. It'll say 3,200 barrow. And so basically, you just set 3,200. It'll take a little bit of time in the PMDG, unfortunately, but that's the proper procedure. So you guys know how to do that. The second thing, we've added on the ACARS runway list for the notes, in parentheses, the AGL height for any non-standard min cleanup altitude. Standard min cleanup altitude is 1,000 feet above airport elevation. All you have to do, if you don't see anything in the notes and you see just the min cleanup up there, you're going to bug min cleanup, and then you're going to go to the takeoff ref page 2, make sure everything is 1,000. Okay, that's standard. 1,000 for thrust reduction height, 1,000 for acceleration height, 1,000 for engine out acceleration height. Make sure they're all 1,000. That's standard. Now, if it's non-standard, you're going to see a note here of non-standard engine out and all engine min cleanup altitude, 3,200 in this case. It might break them down. There might be one that's engine out is specific, one is all engine specific. So it's very important you take a look and make sure you're checking which runway over here, that you go through the basically you scroll down and you look at the runway that you're going to be departing. You go over to the right and you make sure that you're reading that note for that runway that you're going to be using, or that runway intersection departure. Very important to take a look at those notes, okay? So in this case, you're going to look at the parentheses 1019. You're going to go to your takeoff ref page 2, and in this case, since engine out and all engine are the same height of 1019. They're not different. You're going to put in 1019 for your thrust reduction height, for your acceleration height, and for your engine out acceleration height. They're all going to be 1019 in this case. So you don't have to do the math anymore. We did it for you. You can just do that, and boom, you're perfect. You're complete compliance per Southwest Airlines.
There you go. Okay. Also, if you ever had a bleeds off takeoff, it should say that there too, and that's also more than likely going to end up with a max thrust takeoff and probably a situation where you've got a higher flap setting like a flaps 15 or a flaps 25, more likely like a flaps 25. That's going to be at high. It's probably hot. You're probably heavy, but we've got a video for that too on an engine bleeds off takeoff. Okay, what else?
Very important. Got to use that flap setting that PWB gives you. You can't just say, "Oh, I want to use this instead." No, you got to use this flap setting because these numbers are only valid for that flap setting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very important. You got to use that flap setting for those numbers to be valid.
Yep.
The other thing too is make sure that before you load into LUVCARS or before you do this performance, you calculate the performance. Make sure that your airplane's loaded correctly. You have the right zero fuel weight in the airplane. You have the right amount of fuel per your dispatch release. So the best way to do this, and we'll make a video in the future, basically going through the motions of LUVCARS 5 in a real world scenario or like in a simulated scenario in the sim, where basically we'll show you how to program the FMC properly, get your zero fuel weight in there and everything like that. So the best way to do this, if you go to the FS Actions page in PMDG, you go to payload, you manually enter your zero fuel weight, that'll get your zero fuel weight spot on with your dispatch release. So that's step one. Step one, go to the dispatch release, see what your zero fuel weight is, and then input that into your FMC, into the FS Actions payload page. Second thing, load up your fuel. Look at your maximum planned fuel on your dispatch release. Make sure that your takeoff weight is not going to exceed ATOG. So takeoff weight does not exceed ATOG. Zero fuel weight does not exceed max zero fuel weight. Perfect. Looks good. All right, cool. I'm going to take all that fuel, maximum planned. Here we go. We're going to put that into our fuel into the airplane. Now, through FSU IPC, LUVCARS 5 literally knows exactly how much your airplane weighs. So that's not a problem anymore. So all you have to do now on the right-hand side in LUVCARS 5 for the performance tab, you make sure that that zero fuel weight is set correctly, make sure that fuel is set correctly. Also, you want to go into settings of LUVCARS 5. You need to make sure all of those SimBrief sync options are all selected that by default. So make sure those are all checked, those boxes are checked, and you should be good with that. And then basically you just go through all of these different parameters, engine out, engine antis. Do I require engine antis? No. Okay. I'm not going to worry about it. So you just need to just go through all these. Is wind shear going to be possible on takeoff? If not, then don't worry about it. All this information is in the user's guide for LUVCARS 5. So if you want to go through the user's guide for LUVCARS 5, you should be able to get better information regarding all of the parameters on the right-hand side. But that's another thing that could possibly change your MRTW. If you're having issues with a good MRTW, you need to get a higher weight. You're kind of weight restricted in that sense. Not just selecting a different runway, but also maybe changing your parameters, maybe turning bleeds to no in this case, or forcing a max thrust takeoff. Maybe that'll help with your MRTW. So there's just different things that you can play around with to try to get a better weight for takeoff. And that's pretty much all I got.
Sure. And in the wind shear, of course, you're going to select yes if there's wind shear advisories effect in the ATIS. As far as the engine anti-ice is concerned, if you're using an RCC of 5 or less, so let's say the runways are wet and your outside air temperature was 10 degrees or colder, that's when you'd want to select engine anti-ice on. Otherwise, you can leave it off. If it was 5 degrees but you're dry, you don't need it. So it's going to be a combination of the two. Okay. Next one, and we'll try to get through this one quickly here. So another scenario, this is also Vegas. So we've changed a few parameters here. We selected engine ice, yes. Max thrust, yes. Wind shear, yes. So in this case, we should have had a colder temperature. It would have been 10 degrees or less with a 5 good or less. But we'll just play with it here.
We just did for the example.
Just for the example.
Yeah,
sure.
Correct. Yeah.
Here we did use one right at Bravo, 7,873 feet available. ATOG remained the same. The MRTW actually went up. We got a field length limit in this case. Max thrust, and that's of course going to affect the MRTW because remember what we said, if you do a max thrust takeoff It's actually looking to give you the best MRTW possible. So that's why that went up. 100.4 max thrust, so there's no thrust reduction as far as temperature is concerned. Flaps 15 in this case. V speeds of 129, 131 slash 151. We'll talk about that. 140, 4.4 on the trim, and cleanup stayed the same EFP procedure. And what the wind shear thing here is, you got two VR numbers. You got your regular VR and you got an accelerated VR. And so the way you handle wind shear is you want to bug V2 still, 140 knots. And what you're going to do is if you had a wind shear caution after V1 of 129, of course you're never going to abort after V1, but you had a wind shear caution, let's say at 130 knots, you're going to rotate at 131 knots. If you had a wind shear caution at, let's say, 140 knots, you're going to rotate at 140 knots without any cautions whatsoever. You're going to rotate at 151 knots. You just have to write that down somewhere. A lot of guys will just put it in the scratch pad on the FMC. So usually the one pilot takes off in the takeoff page where it shows the V speeds, and just put 151 down there in the scratch pad. Use that accelerated VR anytime you're using wind shear. So, of course, if you had a engine failure, you'd still climb out at your V2 of 140 knots. Really, nothing else changes on that page. John, anything?
The only thing I'd say is if you have less than 2,000 feet remaining, you do not delay rotation. You do not wait till that 151. You need to rotate
There you go.
within that 2,000 feet remaining from the runway end.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great point. You don't want to run off the end of the runway just because of wind shear. Okay. Let's see. We had a couple things here. Actually, I don't think there was much to introduce here. This was just another example. We actually had a climb limit here with the MRTW. Reduce thrust setting, trim, and cleanup altitude. Pretty standard there, 1,065. Here we've got a runway heading. This is not a special. This is just a standard. So you're going to basically, in an event of an engine failure, at min cleanup altitude, you're just going to continue on runway heading 096. We have runway 10 left selected here. All right, so all those engine failure procedures are essentially runway heading in that case. And I think our last, that's, I believe, our last example. So, John, anything else to add? I think that's about covers it on my end.
I do. And this is not something official, but this is just more of a technique thing. But something to keep in mind when you got, more complex EFP. So even if it's just a direct heading at 9, is it 046 or 096?
096.
All right. So 096 in this case, you could just bug 096 in your course window, and that could be a reminder to you, okay, I'm going to fly runway heading. If I lose an engine after V1, I'm going to just fly runway heading. Something else you can do is you can use the left course for, if it says LT, for instance, you put in the left course. For RT, you can put in the right course to remind yourself, hey, this could be a left turn, this could be a right turn. Like, for instance, off runway 31 center at midway, if you bug 210 in the left course, that could be a reminder it's going to be a left turn heading a 210. Just, it's all for technique. It's nothing official or anything, but that definitely can help you. So if for instance, if you go back to the one at Vegas real quick, if we look at that EFP chart, so in this case, this is basically continuing on this. Yeah, so this one would not apply. But we'd have to look at one off runway like 26 right, for instance, if we looked at a different one, which I don't think we have ready for this video. But just, if you ever see that in the, like, for instance, right here, this one says right turn heading is 090. This is perfect. So basically, you could set 090 in the right course, and that could remind you, okay, it's in the right course, it's going to be a right turn. Just something simple that could help you. But you just said 090, and okay, once I hit that 3.8, once I hit that green arc, that from the IMDW localizer distance 3.8, I'm gonna make a right turn heading at 090. So just something to think about.
Yep, and it doesn't work obviously in the heading because more than likely off of a departure, especially at midway, everything is a heading after departure. So obviously you can't set 090 in your heading window. So yeah, it's a great way to set up your reminder for yourself. Okay, landing performance. I'm actually glad we stumbled upon this because I would have forgotten about it completely. So landing performance, landing data, outside air temperature of 25 degrees. In this scenario here, wind 0404, altimeter runway 10, landing weight, or it's our proposed landing weight or planned landing weight of 125,200 pounds, max runway landing weight of 129.2, and that's actually a structural limit for the aircraft itself. That's the aircraft's limitation or structural landing weight limit. In this case, flaps 30, and we can select which flaps we want to run. Do we want 30? Do we want 40? In this case, we selected 30. Some different reasons you might choose 40. Usually a short runway. If it's gusty winds, but it was a short runway, I might use flaps 30. Ref speed of 132, target of 137. We can talk about target calculations. John, I'll let you do that because I'm talked enough. Auto brakes 2 is going to give you a 61-foot stopping margin, meaning I'll stop 61 feet from the end of the runway if I don't intervene. This is, of course, using the reverse thrust. Auto brakes 3 will give me 1,660 feet of stopping margin. Auto brakes max 3,192. Remarks, check wing frost of fuel temp less than 5 degrees. And we've got our different LUVCARS runways and runway length available. One other thing I'll touch on, and I'll let John talk about the speeds. Anytime you have a runway condition code of 5 or less, or if you're going to land with flaps less than 30, auto brakes are required. And I've actually asked the guys to see if they could throw in a note there where it will give you an automatic auto brake required if you were to have one of those two conditions. There is one other condition where auto brakes are required, and that is if reported visibility is less than 4,000 foot RVR or 3/4 of a mile. So of course the flaps landing less than 30 would be, for instance, in a single engine landing or abnormal configuration. Your normal landing flap settings are either 30 or 40. John, you want to talk about the winds?
Yeah, for sure. And then also, the other time you could do, yeah, actually, no, I think you just mentioned it. Flaps 15, you mentioned it right at the end there. Gusty winds with a pretty long runway, like at Vegas. I know pilots that like to go with flaps 15,
Sure.
kind of, older cowboy pilots at Southwest. But hey,
Yep.
it works,
Just
and
remember, auto
it's
brakes
definitely
would be
something that's done.
required. Yep.
Absolutely, yep. Auto brakes required with flaps 15 landing. So VREF, just a quick definition, it's just going to be your VSO times 1.3. That's a textbook definition of VREF, and that's the speed of basically we want to be touching down at. We want to be roughly around 132 knots touching down on the runway, about 1,500 feet beyond the threshold of the runway, about the 1,500 foot markers. V target is wind based. So basically, VREF is weight based. V target is wind based. So V target is going to be your approach speed, and that's going to be 5 knots at a minimum, 5 knots above your VREF. So VREF plus 5. The most it'll ever be is VREF plus 15. And the way we calculate V target is a little bit different than GA small airplanes. That's a completely different thing, but I know some people are going to think that's how you do it for all airplanes, and that's just not the case. For airliners, the way we do it, we take half of the headwind component for that runway based off of the wind, and then we add the full gust component, headwind component. We only care about headwind component, okay? So it's half of the headwind component plus all of the gust headwind component. So that's how we calculate V target, and it's never going to exceed exceed VREF plus 15 knots to ensure that we don't exceed the flap placard speed. That's the gist of it. You covered the auto brake distances pretty well. The only thing I would add to that is, obviously Southwest unfortunately has a history of, skirting off runways. We know about this in the news and everything. So the FAA basically has increased the requirements for landing distances to Southwest. So basically, there's a 15% safety margin added to these distances, and on top of that, 500 feet added to the distance. So in this case, 61 feet would actually be 561 feet remaining, but any positive value is good at Southwest. So as long as you have a positive value in your auto brakes and there's no dashes, you're able to use that auto brake. If you have dashes for that auto brake setting, you cannot use that auto brake setting because these landing numbers, these data numbers here are only good for these set auto brake values. The other thing too is auto brake 1 is not authorized at Southwest Airlines, so we can't use auto brake 1. It doesn't really do much for the airplane anyways, so it's only auto brake 2, auto brake 3, auto brake max. Real quick, Joe, do you want to go over the equivalences of manual braking using these auto brake numbers?
Yeah, essentially, well, I think this is what you're talking about. Essentially, what we're saying is if you use auto brake, it doesn't equate to a deceleration rate. It actually just equates to the amount of pressure that the brakes put on the jet. So what I mean by that is if I had auto brakes 2 selected, there's a certain amount of pressure that's going to be applied to the brakes. And if I use reverse thrust, that's actually going to decrease the amount of pressure to the brakes. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And basically, autobrake 2 equivalence is when the airplane is decelerating through 80 knots. It's basically light brake pressure at 80 knots. You're just continuously using light brake pressure at 80 knots, and that's equivalent to autobrake 2. Autobrake 3, basically, right when the nose wheel touches the ground, it's basically medium brake pressure at that point, all the way down until the point that either the airplane stops on the runway or brake pressure is actually applied manually by the pilots, and then that will trigger the auto brake disarm light. So the amber light will come on, call out as auto brake disarm, and then that's at that point the auto brakes are no longer working when you get that light, and that's why you have to use manual braking at that point. But basically, that's the equivalent of auto brake 3, and then auto brake max. Basically, once that nose touches down, you're stopping. It's like full pressure, the airplane's definitely going to stop. So it's definitely aggressive. But that's how auto brake max works. The equivalence would basically be the nose drops. You just apply full brake pressure pretty much. And then I'll be honest, I am not too familiar with the remark here. Check wing frost if fuel temp less than 5 degrees. Joe, if you want to go into that one.
It's not something these guys need to worry about in the real world. When you've been at cruise for hours, your jet fuel gets awfully cold in the wings, and what can happen is if your fuel temp is less than 5 degrees on the fuel gauge, above your fuel on your fuel panel, above your fuel pump switches, the idea is go out there and look at the wings. You can develop frost on the wings underneath and above the wing in that black square. And it's kind of like a Coke can where you get condensation because it's super cold on the inside, warm on the outside. You get the condensation, it freezes. So they're saying, if you've been at cruise for a long time and your fuel temp is less than 5 degrees, go out there and check the wings, make sure you don't have frost on the wings. And it's typically going to form on the underside. Nothing you guys need to worry about. But it's a remark, it's pretty standard. So the guys here that developed the software added it in. Uh, Last thing I will mention or say is flaps 40. Another note about flaps 40. Anytime you have an auto brake with a zero stopping margin, or we would say it's bracketed. In this case, we'll just say it's zero or there's no entry there. That's in a situation where flaps 40 is recommended. So then you could drop this drop down box to 40 and rerun the numbers and see if you get positive stopping margin with auto brakes too. If you don't, no big deal. Just flaps 40 is recommended anytime you have a negative stopping margin with brakes too. That's all. Anything
Awesome,
else?
awesome. I would mention that in the remarks section, the way LUVCARS 5 is set up, pretty much anything that's non-standard with those parameters for takeoff or landing performance is going to show up in the remarks section.
Okay.
So if you have engine anti-ice, you set that to yes, you're going to see that in the remarks. If you have an RCC lower than 6-dry, you're going to see that in the remarks and so on. So if
Yep.
it's non-standard to Southwest Airlines policy for PWB, it's going to show up in the remarks.
Awesome. Okay. I think that's a wrap. Hope that helps. We'll see you later.